In the years following the French and Indian War, the majority of Americans were still loyal to the British Crown. What we know now as a patriot movement was only the rumblings of a minority. The idea of a democratic republic was not popular. The most notable previous democracies and republics were Greece and Rome, and both fell apart. Thus, most people believed a democracy was not a realistic or successful way to run a country. But in the time between the end of the French and Indian War and the start of the Revolutionary War, popular opinion changed, and Americans as a whole realized the value of changing the system of their government to a democracy. But how did this happen? How did the circumstances preceding the American Revolution convince the majority of American colonists to move away from a monarchy and to form a democratic republic, a system of government that had failed miserably in the past? Many of the ideas about liberty and natural rights that would come to define the Constitution had strong roots in the Enlightenment. Coming to height in the late 18th century, this movement laid an ideological foundation from which the American Revolution would stem. Pioneers like John Locke advanced core principles of thought and reason to discredit the monarchical actions of Britain. Literature containing Enlightenment ideals such as Paine's Common Sense and Locke's treatises of government would dramatically influence formation of a democratic American government. The Stamp Act was one of the first controversial events that led to the Revolution. It was a tax imposed by Britain on every piece of paper that American colonists purchased. The tax frustrated the colonists because it was the first tax on internal consumption. Previously, all taxation from Britain was based on trade regulation. Many colonists believed that internal taxation was an overstep of British power and was taxation without representation. This led to a lot of disagreement within the colonies because colonists felt unrepresented in Britain. Consequently, the Stamp Act led to the belief that Britain was trying to control the colonies and was infringing on their liberties as British citizens. The Sons of Liberty was a group of men led by Samuel Adams, whose goal was to achieve American independence from Britain. This group had a major impact on the development of the American Revolution because it enforced the idea that the British were oppressing the colonies. It was also one of the first steps towards an organized movement against the British. The Sons of Liberty was mainly known for starting the Boston Tea Party, as well as protesting the Stamp Act. They also led coups against Stamp Act supporters such as Andrew Oliver and Thomas Hutchinson. The Sons of Liberty grew as an organization because of their organized raids and boycotts, which led to a united front against the monarchical reign of the British. The occupation of Boston by British troops in 1769 worried many colonists, and it became harder for moderates to argue that the British were not tyrannical. The occupation of Boston caused tension in the colonies, and popular sentiment shifted further away from the London government. Tensions towards the soldiers in Boston boiled over in March of 1770. A crowd in front of a customs house became even more unruly and threw rocks and snowballs at the soldiers. Amidst the chaos, shots were fired and 3 Americans were killed. This event incensed the American people, and it was used as propaganda against the British by many patriots. The event was proof of British tyranny to many Americans. It showed that the British were willing to use force against the colonists if necessary to keep them obedient, and it made other colonies nervous that something similar could occur in their colony as well. After the actions of the Sons of Liberty at the Boston Tea Party transpired, Great Britain decided to punish the colonists. This came in the form of what the colonists called intolerable acts, which included the closure of Boston's ports and harbor, sending more troops to Boston, and increasing British authority in the city. Angry colonists responded by boycotting British goods, and colonists outside of Boston became fearful of the British and the power they were exerting over Boston. The tension of these circumstances put the colonists in a state of confusion, and a larger number began to have doubt in the British government. The use of literature was also instrumental in swaying popular opinion of Americans not only towards independence, but also in favor of a democratic system of government. Perhaps the most influential piece of writing leading up to the war was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Before this treatise was written, most Americans believed there were problems with Britain, but they still desired to reconcile with them. Paine argued against this kind of thinking in Common Sense. He blamed the monarchy system for the colony's problems, not individual politicians. He also denied that the colonists needed Britain and called for a new nation to be built on liberty. His writing became famous, and it caused many Americans to change their minds and support the independence movement. Perhaps even more importantly, it caused the majority of Americans to seriously consider democracy as a viable possibility for one of the first times. In response to Britain's coercive acts, the colonies formed the First Continental Congress. Acting as the government for 13 colonies, delegates met to organize colonial resistance with an emphasis on equality and free debate. Efforts were at first reconciliatory. The Second Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, which stated that the colonies were still loyal to the British Crown but wanted to have the full rights of British citizens. The Congress insisted that they were not looking for independence. The idea of setting up a democratic republic was not present in the minds of this group yet. However, as tensions rose and revolution began, a second convening would come to supervise a war and fight for independence. The Continental Congress was essentially the culmination of all of the factors causing America to consider a democratic republic. It was through this that the colonies declared independence and formed a government based off of ideas such as all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights. The Continental Congress was the end of monarchy in America. It was the final piece of the puzzle in America's transition from a monarchy into a democracy.